Good evening and welcome to the British School at Rome, both those of you joining us here in the lecture theatre and those following online. I'm Christopher Shevitsky, a research fellow at the British School and director of the City of Rome course, our annual master's programme on the topography and archaeology of Rome. Tonight's talk is both the first of the public lectures accompanying the course, as well as the Geoffrey Rickman Memorial Lecture, given in memory of the Emeritus Professor of Roman History at the University of St Andrews and long-term affiliate of the British School, who passed away in 2010. Geoffrey Rickman studied classical archaeology at Oxford under Bernard Ashmole and Ian Richmond, both former BSR directors, and he first came to the school in 1958 on a Henry Francis Pelham studentship. A seemingly unknowing pioneer of ecotourism and responsible travel, the journey took him 36 hours, coming by boat, train, and bus. While in Italy, Geoffrey Rickman began studying the buildings of Rome and Ostia, which was to form the basis of a DPhil thesis that then developed into the 1971 book, Roman Granaries and Store Buildings. Rickman's second book tackled the related question of the corn supply of ancient Rome, published by Oxford University Press in 1980. Written mostly during a 3-month stay at the British School, remarkably, it was the first English language book to tackle the subject and was guided by the idea set out by the author in the introduction that what I wanted to know was how the ancient world really worked. Since publication of these works, both areas of study have grown significantly in prominence, and his book remains foundational reading. Likewise, Rickman's later interest in Roman ports, about which he wrote 10 articles between 1985 and 2008, has developed into a flourishing area of research, not least here at the British School, and Geoffrey Rickman was a strong supporter of its flagship archaeological project at Portus. In serving the BSR, Geoffrey Rickman became a member of Faculty of Archaeology, History and Letters in 1979, then chairman of the faculty from 1983 to 1987, and was made overall chair of council in 1997 upon having retired from St Andrews, where for over 3 decades he had been instrumental in building ancient history at the university. As chairman of the school, Geoffrey Rickman helped oversee major structural developments and that included the creation of this lecture theatre. He is described by former colleagues Christopher Smith and John Richardson as a man of great wit, humour, a remarkable scholar, an inspiring teacher, a wise administrator, and a great friend of the British School. It is therefore particularly fitting that tonight's speaker is not only interested in warehouses, Ostia, and wanting to know how the ancient world really worked, but also has deep ties with the BSR. It is my great pleasure to introduce Janet Delane, whose work, who most recently was an associate professor in Roman archaeology at Oxford University, an emeritus fellow at Wolfson College. Janet first visited the school, though, throughout the 1980s when studying and tutoring at the University of Adelaide, becoming a BSR Rome scholar in ancient, medieval, and later Italian studies in 1986. To anyone working in the fields of Roman architecture or urbanism, the pioneering work of Janet Delane has been required reading for the last 3 decades. Her seminal book on the baths of Caracalla was published in 1997 and won the Archaeological Institute of America's James R. Wiseman Award for the most important work in archaeology the following year. It proved not only the then definitive work on that specific monument, but ushered in a wave of new research around the quantification of manpower and the costs of construction in Roman architecture. Alongside her knowledge of and perceptions into understanding the building industry in general, Janet is particularly recognized for her work at Ostia, which includes a survey of the insula of the paintings in the 1990s, numerous articles on the city ever since, and a forthcoming monograph on the port city. It was to the work on urban development of Ostia that Janet also awarded a Hugh Last Senior Fellowship at the British School in 1999. Amid an extensive publication record, 3 very recent volumes are especially worthy of note. In 2023, Janet co-edited From the Palatine to Piero Ligorio, Architectural, Sculptural and Antiquarian Studies in Memory of Amanda Claridge. Last year also saw the publication From Concept to Monument, Time and Costs of Construction in the Ancient World, papers in honour of Janet Delane. While not technically contributing to the latter, the papers by colleagues and former students is a testimony to her impact in the field and on those she taught. Finally, and promised to be out soon, very soon, I'm told the 25th of May, we are now keenly awaiting the release of the forthcoming book, Roman Architecture, with Oxford University Press. This evening's lecture is titled Servicing Ostia, Transport, Logistics and Deliveries in Rome's Imperial Port. About our speaker, it has been written that they shun mere aestheticism and abstract reflections. Rather, she studies the nuts and bolts of Roman architecture. Tonight, I suspect we might also get hooves and wheels. Will you please welcome Janet Delane?
Good evening, everyone. And thank you, Chris, for that kind introduction. I met Geoffrey Rickman the first time I ever came to the BSR, which is more than 40 years ago, and we intersected on many later occasions. He was indeed one of the kindest and funniest people I have ever met, and I'm both delighted and honoured to be giving this lecture in his memory. As Chris has sort of preempted a little bit, my topic is inspired by two key aspects of Geoffrey's interest in Roman antiquity that we shared. A fundamental desire to understand how the ancient world really worked, however banal the subject matter might appear to be at first sight, and this long-standing and deep engagement with Rome's port city of Ostia. It also takes up and follows on from some of my previous studies on the commercial landscape of Ostia and on the logistics of construction, and tries to address some questions that I raised in those studies. This is very much a work in progress, and I've had to leave out a number of possible threads I had hoped to include, but which in the end proved too intractable. In what follows, I make no apologies for the numbers. They are rounded numbers. They're not meant to appear precisely accurate. They're just general numbers, but I have at least tried to put them on the slides to make them easier to follow for me as well as for you. Let us start with some basics. Oh, yes. Okay. Goods traffic in the Roman city can be divided into sorry, I seem to have lost myself somewhere. No, it's all right. I always do this at the start, and then I get into it and things kind of go a bit better. So, I have no idea where I am. Oh, I see where I was. Sorry about that. Okay, start again. Take a drink. Start again. Okay. One of the new ways, one of the many new ways of investigating ancient cities in the 21st century is the shift from looking at them just in terms of static spaces to experiencing them in terms of movement through the city, particularly in relation to wheeled vehicles. So far, however, most of the work has focused on the city of Rome because that provides the written texts, whether they're literary or legal, and on Pompeii, which supplies the physical environment, particularly those ruts in the streets. In particular, I'm thinking of the work of Ray Lawrence, Eric Poehler, and Cornelius van Tilburg. Very little, however, has been done on the city of Ostia in any detail, outside of the question of moving grain from the city of Rome into storage, and even that not much. Yet Ostia was a very large city in Roman terms, with perhaps some 50,000 inhabitants, more presumably in the peak sailing season, and with the added complication of being the busiest port in the Roman Empire. This is reflected in the extent of the city at its height in the 2nd century AD, which you can see here in this new plan from the geophysical survey carried out by the German Archaeological Institute in Rome, which also, in brown there, also gives us the main framework of the street network. Now, in order to explore the size and nature of the problems that servicing Ostia might have created, we need some estimates of the quantities involved in moving goods around the city. This evening, I will concentrate on foodstuffs, fuel, and construction materials. In other words, the bulk commodities. Right. So let's start with some basics. Goods traffic in the Roman city can be divided into that carried by the feet of human porters or pack animals, and that by wheels, carts of various kinds. The loads that porters can carry depend very much on the physical size, age, and fitness of the porters, and on the degree to which they are used to carrying loads. Now, modern health and safety regulations suggest maximum loads in the range of 20 to 25 kilos. But historically, over short distances, perhaps 500 meters or so, experienced porters can carry 50 kilos, and indeed, for some of the largest and fittest, as much as 80. Coalmen in Britain, now a thing of the past, delivered 100-weight sacks equal to 50 kilos on a regular basis, including right up the stairs of the 10-storey Glasgow tenements. Over longer distances, say a kilometre, the carrying capacity is reduced to 30 to 40 kilos, but the speed is fairly slow, only about 3 to 3.5 kilometres an hour. I walk at about 5 to 6 kilometres an hour. The skeletal evidence from one cemetery at Ostia suggests that we should be thinking of loads in the upper region of the possible. 200 plus simple burials of men in their 20s to 40s all showed sign of biomechanical alterations and trauma, including fractures of limbs and spinal columns, all consistent with heavy lifting and carrying. The depictions of porters in Roman art, like this figure of Zacharias from Ostia, strongly suggest that they were a common element of the landscape, the cityscape. We should also not forget that 2 or more men between them can carry heavier loads if slung on poles like in this famous relief from Pompeii, although the size of the load is likely to be somewhat less than double that which could be carried individually. This happens every time you have to multiply the carrying force. Yeah. There's far less evidence, either in Roman art or in physical remains, for the use of donkeys or mules as pack animals, although the descriptions in Apuleius' The Golden Ass make it clear that this was a normal occurrence. This terracotta model of a donkey carrying 2 amphorae then therefore comes from archaic Cyprus, but we should assume that it would have been recognizable to an ancient Roman as well. There are many available figures for the carrying capacity for these animals from a variety of sources, mostly 19th century or modern. As with human porters, it depends on the size of the animal and its fitness. In India, donkeys carry loads of brick up to 100 to 120 kilos in weight. Other sources suggest that 70 to 90 kilos might be a maximum. Mules are larger and stronger and can carry roughly twice that of a donkey. A 1965 Prevention of Cruelty Act in India limits loading mules to 200 kilograms, although 19th century figures suggest that loads up to 350 kilos were also carried. Both donkeys and mules can walk at speeds of up to 4 to 4.5 kilometers an hour, but always with the proviso that it's less if they're heavily loaded. On the other hand, ox carts and mule carts appear quite frequently in Roman art, the first shown carrying mainly goods and the second mainly passengers. Historically, a 2-wheeled cart pulled by a pair of mules might carry up to a ton, but lighter loads are more likely, and when carrying passengers, definitely more common. For a 4-wheeled heavy wagon pulled by a pair of oxen, it could rise to 2 tons, but again, this is an exception, and you might therefore use 2 pair of oxen rather than 1. Mule carts had the advantage on open ground of greater speed than ox carts, up to 4.5 kilometers as opposed to 2 kilometers an hour, but you do wonder how much an advantage that would be in the crowded streets of the city. While the late antique codex Theososianus gives much lower maximum loads for carts, around 400 maximum, which is sometimes seen as the sort of maximum for the Roman Empire, it's actually in the context of the cursus publicus, where speed was more important than the actual load carry. So I think I am going to go with a heavier loading. Each had their advantages and limitations within the city, with respect to the size of the loads, the speed of travel, and the distance that could be travelled, but also in terms of flexibility. Human porters are by far and away the most flexible. They're self-loading and unloading, They're not troubled by curbs or steps, and depending on the type of load, can pass through relatively narrow doorways and occupy little space in the street. Pack animals are also well suited to cities, as, like men, they're not unduly troubled by uneven surfaces, small steps, or narrow streets, providing they're suitably loaded, but have the disadvantage of needing careful loading and unloading to keep balanced. Carts are a different matter entirely, as wheeled vehicles work best on level paved or surfaced roads and cannot easily rise over curbs. Another disadvantage is their width. The four-wheeled cart found in the Villa Ariana at Stabia had its wheels set 5 Roman feet, that's nearly 1.5 meters apart, and the whole axle was almost 2 meters wide, giving a minimum street width. As it happens, all the excavated through streets in Ostia are at least 3 meters wide. It suggests that they're used to be used for carts. So only the few narrow alleys and internal passageways could be inaccessible. Because it had a pivoting axle, drivers will understand this, I don't because I don't drive. So it had a pivoting axle, so the Stabia cart could turn corners, which is really important. But it was nearly 2 meters long in itself without the animals. So with a pair of mules, you're talking about something that's more like 4 meters long or even longer. A two-wheeled cart found in the Casa di Menandro at Pompeii was shorter, but not that much more adaptable. On the other hand, carts are faster to unload and load than pack animals. But there's another problem with carts, and that's the possibility of legal restrictions. The well-known Lex Julia Municipalis concerns, among other things, the movement of carts, defined as plaustra, in the city of Rome. The main tenets of the law are that no carts are to be driven into the city after sunrise or before the 10th hour, with the following exceptions: anything needed for temples or public building works, carts under contract to remove rubble from demolition of public works, cases where it is lawful for specified persons to bring carts for specified reasons, which to me is the let-out clause to end all let-out clauses, vehicles needed for religious processions, triumphs, and the games, ox or mule carts which came into the city at night and are empty or being used for rubbish removal. Now, there have been lots of interpretations of these restrictions, mainly concerned with A, whether they also applied to cities outside of Rome, and whether the reference to plaustra means all carts or only the heavy-duty wagons. There are no easy answers, but the restriction to night deliveries raises a number of other practical questions to me. For example, the need for lighting in the street and in the place of delivery. Let us now turn to Ostia. Look at how this all might work in practice. I want to start with the essential, that of feeding the population of the city, assuming on average are 50,000 individuals. First of all, there's a supply of grain. The grain dole at Rome was 5 modi per month, but recent calculations have suggested that the average intake of grain should be more like a 3 modi per month, since it includes women and children. On the other hand, for Ostia, where the population is likely to be more weighted towards males than females and children, 3.5 modi might be a good idea. And that gives us about 14,000 tons of grain, which would have to be distributed each year to fit the population. Grain seems to have moved predominantly in sacks by porters. These are the saccarii. It would have made sense for the sacks to contain a specific number of modi to make accounting easier. And all the visual materials shows their size, suggest these ought to be either 5, 6, or 7 modi, which weigh about 35, 41, or 47 kilos. As a comparison, Indian porters regularly move 50-kilo sacks of rice, the standard modern size for storage and marketing. So if we go with 7 modi sacks, on average, each person needs 6 sacks a year. That is 300,000 sacks altogether, or something like 820 sacks a day moving through the streets. If we want 5 modi sacks, you've got to increase that number to over 1,000. The second staple is wine. And here, at least, we know the size of the units to be distributed. Dressel 2-4 wine amphorae, the most familiar type, hold roughly 20 to 25 litres. And with an empty weight of some 13 to 14 kilos, the total weight of a full Dressel 24 would have been in the order of 35 to 40 kilos. That is, it's the same kind of weight as a sack of grain. This is within the carrying capacity of a porter, and indeed there's ample visual evidence for exactly that, as you can see from these two reliefs. Calculations of the quantity of wine per person in the Roman Empire vary widely, from an average of 100 to 250 litres per person per year. So on average, everybody would need at least 4 to 5 amphorae or even up to 10 amphorae per year, the greatest estimate. For 50,000 people, that means 200 to 250,000 amphorae deliveries a year, maybe as many as 500,000. And that's an average of, say, 550 to 650 or even 1,500 per day. The third staple is olive oil. Again, estimates for consumption vary widely, but in the range of 25 to 50 litres per person per year. The higher figure allows for the use of oil in baths and for lighting. Now, oil amphorae vary more widely in size than wine amphorae, but the Dressel 20, the best known and one of the most common ones at Ostia in the 2nd century, contain around 70 to 75 litres of oil, and empty weigh around 30 kilos. So a total weight of getting over 100 kilos. That is outside the carrying capacity of a single person. Now, each individual at Ostia would only need 1 to 2/3 of a Dressel 20 per year, and 50,000 people would need 17 to 33,000 amphorae per year, or 50 to 100 per day. The figures will keep coming, but just kind of take them as they come. How might they be delivered if you cannot put them on the shoulders of porters? A donkey might theoretically carry a Dressel 20 amphora, but not in practice, because the load has to be divided into 2 equal halves. 2 Dressel 20 amphorae might be carried by a mule, 1 on each side, but that gives a finished width, given the shape of them, of nearly 2 meters. In other words, they're as wide as a cart. And a cart pulled by 2 mules, on the other hand, might carry 8 to 10 Dressel 20s. Now, in order to understand the implications of these figures, we need to look at where the goods in question are being transported from and where they're going to. I'm not going to consider, for the most part, the question of moving goods from the Tiber to the main warehouses along the north side of the city, or those orange ones, or indeed the question of what happens in Ostia's extensive Trastevere. Of course, my main concern is how these goods reach the population in the rest of the city. For grain, I will assume that it's stored in the 3 horia at Ostia, which have the raised floors that we associate with granaries, albeit these were installed in the later part of the 2nd century, so leave that as it is. So these are the horia at 182, the Grandi horia, and the horia Antoniniani. This does not preclude the storage of grain in any of the others, at least in the short term, but it helps simplify my analysis. We have no such indications as to where wine or oil might have been stored in bulk off the ships. There was a forum venarium, but its location has been a matter of long dispute and quite heated dispute. And what we know suggests it was more a place of auction than of storage anyway. Destinations are more difficult. At least from the 2nd century onwards, late 2nd century onwards, we can identify a number of bakeries, which are shown here in red. Yes, you can see the red. Most of which, we might note, cluster near these 3 main granaries. The larger, more high status residents, such as the apartments in the Garden House complex, had kitchens and storage space, so could have had direct deliveries of all these 3 commodities. These large apartments are spread, as far as we can tell, through the excavated part of the city. Other places that would perhaps want their own supplies of grain, wine, and oil are the Thermopolia and the Cauponi, the bars and the inns, but sadly we can identify very few of these in the surviving remains. Finally, there must have been retail outlets where customers could bring their own containers and buy in small quantities, and they could be scattered in almost any of the 800 known tabernae in the city. These are all likely to have been scattered throughout, but possibly concentrating in areas of high footfall, near the Forum Theatre and the bars, or near the entrances to the city. at least with the grain, we can calculate some trip lengths. The garden houses, for example, are about 500 metres from the nearest known granary, and the river mouth about 600 metres. In fact, even if we take into account the maximum extent of the site uncovered in the geophysics, nothing is further than 650 metres away from one of the three granaries. If we think back to the carrying distance of a Zacharias at roughly 500 metres, if you're carrying 50 kilos, we can be fairly confident that grain and probably wine in amphorae could have been delivered within the city entirely by human porters. And then we can take this a step further. If nowhere is more than 600 metres from a granary or a wine store, then the average trip distance is 300 metres each way, because you've got to get back again. Outward, loaded, maybe 3 kilometres an hour, 4 kilometres an hour perhaps on the return. And if we assume that porters work efficiently for an 8-hour day, which would be pushing it, then for grain and wine together, we're looking at a minimum of 30 to 40 Sakari and amphora carriers on the streets at any one time. Now, that's all very well in principle, but in practice, of course, it assumes that there are no interruptions to the trips caused by other traffic. So we need to probably increase the number of individuals on the street. Juvenal in Satire 3 complains of being hit on the head by an amphora as he tries to move down a crowded street in Rome. And this must have been a recognised and possibly even a common event. There will always have been times when there were more, and occasionally times there were fewer porters on the move, and places where more of the porters were in the same place at the same time. The area around the Grandi Horia, where the concentration of bakeries was greatest, would have been one of these particularly crowded spaces. And in the late 2nd century, a covered portico was even built between the granary and the largest bakery. Between the two main bakeries is a small square, the Piazza dei Lari, in the circle here, with a covered open-sided loggia and a large drinking fountain in the middle. In the immediate vicinity are also 2 market buildings, one's in yellow, and the well-known Thermopolium on the Via di Diana with the yellow star. The Forum is just beyond. These are all the indicators of a much trafficked area, not just in terms of deliveries, but of buyers and sellers, and congestion seems inevitable. We also have to think about things, what I call intermediate selling places, which was arguably the role of the Dolia de Fossa. Altogether, the 4 of these that so far founded Ostia had a space for at least 260 dolia all told. And from the volumes inscribed on the rims of some of them, a total capacity for around 260,000 litres. They contain about 1,000 litres each. They're often assumed to be for wine, especially given that their volumes are indicated in amphorae, a Roman measure of about 26 litres, which is basically that of a Dressel 2-4 wine amphora. Now, I would argue that this was definitely the case with the Dolia deposit at the Caseggiato di Agno. One of the terracotta plaques decorating the facade of the building shows a ship in full sail. So this may be one of those occasions where we need to think about delivery straight from the docks. That's about 350 metres to the Tiber by the most direct route, or 500 metres from the river mouth. The 40 amphora required to fill each dolium would have weighed about 1.5 tons. A possible, if large, load for an ox cart, fine for 2 mule carts. Now, the ground around the dolia was built up so that the entrance from the street, which is just visible in this picture, it's impossible to take a photo of, is indicated by the yellow arrow, and I don't know if you can see this, but the entrance is about 1 metre above street level, which is very convenient if you're delivering something by cart. Another of the terracotta plaques that decorate the front of the building shows a figure standing between 2 dolia. And at the back, a figure behind a counter, generally interpreted as a scene of sale. The figure between the dolia is much damaged, but it does appear to have an amphora over its shoulder. So the connection here between transport, storage, and retail could hardly be clearer. In general, Carts must also have been the optimum transport for delivering oil amphorae, given their fairly excessive weight. Since the quantities per person are far less and the unit of delivery greater, this may suggest that fewer people bought their oil in transport amphorae, as a simple act of delivery would have been problematic within a domestic building where the width of the doorways and the passages was narrower. Seems to me more likely that oil was obtained from middlemen in these sort of intermediate places. And it may be that some of the Doilio de Fossa warehouses were used for oil and not just for wine. But then so could any of the other warehouses for which no specific function can be assigned. It's interesting that the Magazzino Annonaria opposite the theatre and the adjacent Horia dell'Artemide have a raised pavement in front of the Decumanus, which again may have helped in delivering heavy amphora. The pavement is about 60 centimetres high, similar to that of the axle of the cart from Stabia, so that the bottom of the tray of the cart would have been at just about pavement level. The other places which, of course, might have taken deliveries of whole oil amphora include, again, the Thermopolia, the Cauponii, and the Terni, but also the baths, because oil was an integral part of bathing practice. Grain, wine, and oil do not, however, provide a complete or sufficient diet. And these plaques from Ostia remind us that there were other components to the Roman diet. They included meat, especially pork, eggs, poultry, cheese, olives, nuts, vegetables, fruit, including grapes, etc. Trying to estimate quantities, however, is even much more difficult than for the basic staples, and must have varied even more widely than for wine and oil. But for the sake of argument today, let us assume 200 to 300 grams per person per day. For 50,000 people, this means an average of 10 to 15 tons per day. Loads are likely to be lighter, so that perhaps 400 to 600 trips of 25 kilos for a porter, or 100 to 150 donkey trips, or half of that for mule trips. Small carts are also possible, say around 30 a day. In contrast to the grain, wine, and oil, it's unlikely that the bulk of these goods are arriving at the river port from the Mediterranean. Russell Meggs was convinced that Ostia was served with these highly perishable goods from its own territory, and recent excavations have shown the area east of Ostia quite densely occupied with villas in the 2nd century, some clearly with agricultural capacity. The distances by road would have been in the order of 6 to 7 kilometres, and while some were close enough to the Tiber to warrant the use of boats, the most natural solution, avoiding extra time and labour for transshipment, would have been on foot, a couple of hours' walk with a bag full of vegetable produce, for example, or by pack animal, or by cart, but entering at the Porta Romana. Similar market garden goods could have arrived from even closer, in the area between the Stagnum and the sea to the south of the city, where there is evidence of a centuriation-type rural grid, and is ideally placed for serving the city no more than 3 kilometres away. The most likely access points would have been the Porta Laurentina, the Via del Sabazeo to the east, or the coastal road, which later became the Via Siberiana. Further to the south, inland from the Laurentine coast, where the villas were so thick that Pliny the Younger likened the view to that of cities, the ancient sources agree that there was a heavily wooded area, which was still present in the 16th century. This could have provided forage for the pigs that appear in butchers' reliefs and have been shown from animal bones to be the predominant meat source at Ostia. The age range of the pigs suggests some degree of all-round or on-demand provision, most easily filled from local resources. Presently, this would extend some 15 kilometres from the Porta Laurentina, and this may have gone further in antiquity. This raises the question, of course, of how the meat was brought to market. Given that the waste from whole pigs has been found consistently in 1st and 2nd century contexts at Ostia, the most likely solution is on foot, which of course raises the question of another potential type of traffic hazard at these southern access points. Quantification is impossible, but a herd of pigs coming to market might have outdone in nuisance value any other form of traffic. These same woodlands are the most likely source of another essential provision for the inhabitants of Ostia, domestic fuel. Robin Veal's studies of charcoal remains at Pompeii have shown a mixture of wood and charcoal, with a preponderance of charcoal in domestic contexts, a much lighter and cleaner burning fuel for urban settings, which has nearly twice the calorific value of wood for a third of the weight. If we take her estimate of 1 tonne per head per year, of which 20% is wood and 80% of charcoal, we end up with 90 tonnes of fuel being needed per day for our nominal 50,000 inhabitants. If this was all wood, that would be 140 tonnes. So that makes 90 to 140 carts carrying 1 tonne each, or 900 to 1,400 donkey loads, or 2,500 to 4,000 person loads of 35 kilos each day. The figures are staggering. And they would be so even if we decided on a figure of only 0.5 tonne per person per year, which is at the lower end, in fact, the lowest end of Veal's data. Given the distances involved in reaching the city, carts might seem the most likely option, but it leaves open the question of what happens once they reach the city. Now, fuel was not just needed for domestic cooking and heating, or indeed for small industry, but for the baths. Here we once again can make some recent calculations. An inscription from Misenum, a Roman colony further down the coast towards Campania, records a donation of 400 cartloads of hardwood per year for the local baths. It's just over a cartload a day. Now, this cartload has been put at 400 kilos, but that would only serve a very small set of baths, assuming, of course, it was meant to be for the total needs. A 1 tonne cartload would fit in better with the fuel requirements of baths. Working from the point of view of fuel economy, the Forum baths at Ostia, which are the largest, would have needed around 2 tonnes of fuel a day, as would the baths of the Porta Marina. And the rest of the 16th century baths needed 1 to 1.5 tonnes of fuel. So altogether, we get about 20 tonnes of fuel or therefore 20 cartloads. Incidentally, if you take 1 tonne of seasoned hardwood logs of the type needed for the baths and stick it in a cart, it's about 3 cubic meters, which would fit comfortably in the cart of the size found at the Villa Ariana. So 4-wheeled carts work fine. Now, human and animal porterage would be possible. The fact that each load has a specific destination makes carts much more likely. Indeed, we can plot the most direct routes to most of the baths, and the baths shown here in blue, from the area south of the city. Baths of the Porta Marina and the Terme Marittimi near the garden houses. You want the coastal road, the Via Severiana. For the Terme di Nettuno and the Nuotatore, the Via Sabazzeo is the most likely. So that's the blue arrows. But most of the rest will be most easily served by the Via Laurentina, going either west along the southern Cardo to the Bivio del Castrum, or onwards, or north along the Semite dei Cippi, those are all those red arrows. Only for the 2 baths at the very end of the city is it not easy to reconstruct the most likely delivery route. The distances range from 150 to 700 meters, which give you a journey time of about 20 minutes at the most. Once the carts arrive, they would need to be unloaded and delivered to the service area of the baths. A man could do the basic unloading in half an hour for a tonne of wood, but less if he had help from the workers at the baths, who would then have to move it all into the service areas. One of the interesting features of the larger baths in particular is the way that access to the heating part of the services is optimized for the delivery of fuel. That's those red stars there. For example, the Terme di Nettuno and the Terme dei Sette Sapienti have their access from a side street, so not to block the main through traffic. In the Terme del Trinacri and the Terme del Foro, This is from a short basalt paved siding off the main roads, which seems to have no other particular function than to give access for carts to the baths. The rule, if it did apply to Ostia, which we don't know, that delivery carts were only allowed in the city by night would actually work very well for baths because they needed the fuel by early morning to stoke the boilers and fire up the hypercourse. So if we put together all the goods coming from the south of Ostia, it is clear that the Porta Laurentina must have been one of the pinch points of the system and is worth a closer look. To begin with, the paved part of the Via Laurentina, where it goes through the old city gate and up to the intersection with the Cemita dei Cippi, is only 3 meters wide and barely 4 wall to wall, so insufficient really for 2 carts to pass side by side. If we assume that a third of the farm or market garden produce comes through the Porta Laurentina, which would be 50 donkey loads or 10 to 11 cart loads, to which we have to add 900 to 1,400 donkey loads or 90 to 140 carts for domestic fuel, plus another 9 large cartloads of wood for the baths, which are reached from the Porta Laurentina. We put all of this together. Even the best case scenario means we're talking about 1 cart every 7 minutes passing through this narrow pace. And that's across the 14 hours between the 10th hour and sunrise. The worst case scenario means it's 1 every 4 or 5 minutes. Even if we went for the lowest possible figure for domestic fuel, we're still talking about a cart every 12 minutes. So this suggests that bringing the farm produce and at least some of the domestic fuel by donkeys or mules as pack animals could move some of this traffic into the city by day and reduce congestion considerably. As we've seen, the carts laden with fuel for the baths would have gone straight to their destinations, 6 off along the Cardo Maximus and 3 along the Cemita dei Cippi. We can see here very clearly how the siding of the Cemita dei Cippi, which is this bit here, might serve to move some of the cart traffic out of the way while it's being unloaded, as well as allowing the carts to turn around, which is something one else has to think about. The nearby bakery would also have been an obvious destination for fuel, most likely through the wider entrance, which is on the same Cemita dei Cippi. Then there's a partly excavated building identified as Horia, which has rooms in what was once thought to be its open court on the model of the Grandi Horia. Given the presence of the nearby bakery, this may have been, at least in part, a grain store. But if so, we have to think about where that grain is coming from. If from the river harbour, then we have to allow for considerable 2-way traffic along the Cemita dei Cippi, which is just wide enough, but would make the siding at the Forum Baths even more useful. Alternatively, the grain may be coming from the south, along with the rest of farm produce, which means we'd be looking at an even higher number of carts or pack animals at this point. The Horia, in fact, would make a useful intermediate point for any goods coming from the south, which don't have a single fixed destination. One oddity about the Horia relates to a number of small travertine boundary markers, Cippi, along the Cemita dei Cippi. The inscription on 2 of them reads, Haec Cemita Horiorum, P-R-I est. The date of interpretation of these very short inscriptions are much disputed, but Catherine Saliu argues that the PRI should be interpreted as Populi Romani Juris, and that Cemita here does not mean street, as is usually thought, but pavement, giving us this pavement belongs to the Horia by decree of the Populus Romanus. The text itself, it has been suggested, ought to belong to a late Republican or Augustan date, but the carving of it really is imperial. And the Horia themselves are in mid-1st century AD. Trying to imagine a scenario behind this ruling, which was sufficiently current to be maintained into the empire, makes me wonder if it were not tied to the kind of chaos which might ensue at this very busy intersection. In other words, keep off our pavement. And we should not forget the occasional herd of pigs and perhaps other livestock, poultry or even cattle, given the relatively high percentage of cow bones in the archaeological record, which are also coming into the city at this point. Here, I wonder if the campus of the Magna Mater, the formalization of which is close in date to the Horia across the way, might not have acted as a livestock market, and indeed as what we might now call a farmer's market, for goods coming into the city from the south. We have lots of evidence from the written sources of intermittent and others, visual sources, for intermittent markets being set up in other public places, from the site to Julia in Rome, or the Forum at Pompeii. And even today, a cattle fair is held in the city centre of Bergamo. The entrance to the campus is wide and has a ramp instead of steps, which lead down from the later higher level of the road. So that makes it potentially accessible not just for carts, but for animals on the hoof. I now want to turn to my final section and talk about the impact of construction on traffic in the city, starting with a single building project, the 3 apartment houses of Insula 142-4. The building is preserved in part up to the 3rd floor and might also have had a 4th. So it's possible to make a reasoned reconstruction of the building and therefore calculate the quantities of materials. The reconstruction allows us to calculate the quantities of materials and to make a rough estimate of the average weight of material. You just have to take my word for this. If the building was 3 floors high, it would require nearly 3,000 cubic meters of material of various kinds: brick and roof tile, tufa for reticulate, rubble fill, lime, pozzolana, timber, etc. And that would weigh in the order of about 8,000 tons. For 4 floors, we got 3.5 cubic meters and nearly 9,500 tons. Construction period, possibly about 4 years. So we're looking at 2,000 to 2,500 cartloads per year, or 5.5 to 6.5 per day. What we also have to take into account is that this is not the first building on the site. Demolition provides large quantities of materials, some of which can be recycled, especially as rubble for the core of the walls. There's plenty of evidence for this process in Roman architecture. If all the core of the buildings use recycled material, then the weight of new material is reduced down to 4,500 tons for 3 floors, or 5.5 or a bit more for 4 floors. Over 4 years of construction, then we've got 1,100 or 1,500 cartloads a day. And that's only 3 or 4 cartloads per year, and that's only 3 or 4 a day. The only other thing we have to take into account is that the ground level for the building project, including the garden area, was raised by about 1.3 meters, and that suggests 1,800 cubic meters of fill. This was a mix of archaeological debris, including building waste from which everything reusable has been removed, general debris, including broken amphorae, other pottery, animal bones, fragments of mosaic and wall plaster, and a whole heap of other assorted rubbish of the kind that would come from a city dump. It is not easy to work out an average weight for this material, but if we assume 1,600 tons altogether, or 400 tons a year, that's another 1 to 2 cartloads per day on average. However, given the amount of building waste involved, half to 2/3 of this might have come again from the demolition of the previous building. So we might only need 1 cartload of fill. Many of the building materials would have arrived at Ostia by river. Certainly the brick and tile, which come from the Middle Tiber Valley beyond Rome. Lime, either via the Anio, then on the Tiber, or by sea from Terracina to the south. The tufa for the reticulate and the pozzolana are more difficult, possibly down river, but also possibly by road, in which case the entry point would be the Porta Romana. And for reticulate, of course, old ashlar blocks already at Ostia may have provided suitable material for the reticulate. Overall then, over the 4 years of construction and allowing for as much reuse as possible, we're looking on average at only 4 or 5 cartloads arriving at the building site per day, and many coming the short distance from the Tiber. Thus, compared to the traffic impact of food or fuel, construction of a single medium-sized building would have been, if not negligible, at least of limited impact. However, in the first 3 decades of the 2nd century AD, large swathes of Ostia were under construction, and that puts a very different complexion on things. I've tried to show in this plan the main building projects from the end of Trajan's reign through that of Hadrian, divided into 5-year blocks, plus in green, those buildings generally assigned to the Hadrianic period, but not otherwise more closely dated. Some of these dates are increasingly being revised by modern scholars, but for my purposes, it's acceptable enough. Now, calculating the volume and weight of building tiers for every single Hadrianic building in Ostia would be a very large undertaking, and I don't intend ever to do it. Instead, I've extrapolated from the volume of material per square metre of construction calculated for the insula of the paintings to estimate the volume of construction for the period AD 115 to 120. I've used the value for a 3-story version to give a conservative estimate. The depth of landfill varies for each building. The insula of the painting is one of the highest, so I've assumed a lower average depth of fill of 1 metre, which actually makes the sums much easier anyway. So the buildings securely dated to this period have a built footprint of roughly 17,000 square metres, which means 72,000 cubic metres of construction and 17 to 18,000 cubic metres of fill. And that's over 5 years. So if all of this was done with new materials, we're up about 80 carts a day. If there's a maximum reuse of demolition material, 30 carts per day. Since we do not know the size of the earlier buildings and just how much material was available for reuse, it's safe to assume somewhere between the two, perhaps 50 carts a day. To this, we need to add around a quarter more to account for the proportion of the unattributed Hadrianic structures, so more like 60 to 65 carts. This is not just for the 5-year period, because this is duplicated over the next decade before tailing off somewhat at the end of Hadrian's reign. While the volume of traffic is not quite as high as that we have calculated for the supply of fuel, it is of the same order of magnitude. But there is a difference in that every building site constitutes a fixed destination, but all are not of the same magnitude. In each period, there were large projects which included open spaces, which would work as construction yards and give a place for carts to be unloaded off the street. In addition, some at least of these were public buildings, the Capitolium, at least 2 large bath buildings, the barracks of the firemen, and some of the Horia and other commercial buildings may have been projects of the town council as well. So under the Lex Julium Municipalis, carts for these could enter the city in the daytime, coming either from the riverbanks or from the Porta Romana. For smaller building projects, pack animals might have been more appropriate. The insula of the painting we looked at earlier could manage with 30 to 40 donkey loads or 15 to 20 mule loads per day, and many projects were even smaller. This would make access to the small building sites much easier and had the added advantage of also being able to operate during the day, although the unloading and loading might still be likely to obstruct the streets, even today. Construction, as we all know, is one of the most disruptive activities for urban transport systems. So, some thoughts in conclusion. This has been something of a thought experiment. We can never know exactly what the traffic was like in Ostia, although I hope I have showed that at times and in certain places, it must have been very dense indeed. You may have noticed that in general, I've been using low averages by maximizing loads and minimizing requirements. But even so, the calculations have at least given a sense of scale to questions about urban traffic and the delivery of goods with which we started. And you can see the results on the slide here. One thing that has emerged is that we need to think more about different types of destinations. Large loads with a single destination suit delivery by carts, but a load which has to be delivered to several destinations involving several halts, unloading or even possibly reloading, and a precise route might better be served by dividing it between several pack animals, each of which could go to a different destination. We can all think of modern parallels. For those of you who live in England, so DHS with all its parcels, or Uber, carrying food deliveries. This also works very well for domestic fuel. There are, of course, many things that I have not touched on, partly through lack of time. I'm not doing too badly, partly because they're even less answerable. One is the particular impact of building projects which require extra heavy loads beyond the capacity of a single pair of oxen. Things like the marble elements for the Capitolium, which would have needed a large train of animals, oxen or mules, precluding any other traffic on the streets. But these are also single events and not a constant element of city traffic. Another is waste disposal of all kinds, including the removal of demolition materials if it wasn't being used in the construction, clearing the dung of the many pack and cart animals that we have identified as necessary for delivering goods to the city. And that, of course, brings to mind the problem of feeding and housing the animals. And if this happens only in the countryside, what impact does this have on delivery schedules and the total number of animals that are needed for this process? I could go on. And of course, this is definitely a work in progress. If it only makes you, serves to make you think about the reality of the past when you walk the often empty streets of Ostia, it will have served its purpose. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Janet, for that incredibly stimulating talk that has definitely repopulated the streets of Ostia. While people in the room gather their thoughts, and invite also those of you listening online, if you have questions, to type them into the chat. I might just ask quickly, you're talking about things per day, 5 carts per day, but presumably there's periods where actually, it's market day and you're getting a huge number of carts coming in. And, we perhaps don't have many literary sources on this, but the literary sources in Rome that complain about traffic, is it about congestion, or it's about when Pliny the Younger is talking, I think in the panegyric, he says that thank goodness the buildings have stopped shaking because they're dragging all of this building material. He says this in a panegyric to Trajan, obviously not knowing what Trajan's going to do. But are there many complaints about food products and things, or is this just an accepted part of everyday life?
I think this is the sort of thing that the ancient sources don't talk about. It's not that, all the complaints are really about building materials because they're the heavy things, the really heavy things. But apart from Juvenal and the amphora carrier, you can imagine kind of amphora the shoulder. There really is not much mention of these everyday occurrences.
Okay. Throw it open to the room for questions. Angela. Oh, just wait for the, sorry, if you just wait for the microphone.
Yes, otherwise I can't hear either.
Thanks, Janet. A really wonderful and, very enlivening talk about what's happening in these cities. And especially at the end, I started thinking about, we had this really interesting perspective on how animals contribute to, the infrastructure of the city. But I wonder, in terms of the needs of like these hundreds to potentially thousands of large livestock, their fodder requirements, their water requirements, do you see signs in the city itself of that being shaped to serve them and their needs in a way? Should we be thinking about these warehouses like at Aplantis storing fodder for animals as well as grain for people, or do you see that being more out in the countryside outside the gates?
That's one of the things I didn't completely get round to, but it is noticeable. I think I put them on one of the maps and then realized I didn't have time to talk about. What I was looking for are troughs. And there at least one or at least a couple of the Horia, the Grande Horia included, have quite large water troughs, which don't seem to have been covered. But I mean, even the street fountains, which were covered, you could put a bucket in and water your animals. And so it would be really interesting to look at that. As for storing fodder, yes, quite possibly. It's really difficult to get the balance, isn't it? Because if you think that the fodder's stored in the city, then you've got to have more animals that bring the fodder. So is that going to work? I say I haven't got much further than that with that one, but has been in my mind.
We have a question from our online audience. Kin Laverno asks, is there any evidence of one-way systems?
No. This is something that people have argued for Pompeii, but it's impossible to tell for Ostia. We don't have the ruts in the street, which is what has been used at Pompeii to get this idea that there are one-way traffic systems. And indeed, some people are beginning to doubt that that was really the case in Pompeii either. The streets of Ostia, all of the through streets, the big streets, can we go back to a plan?
Go back to a slide.
Yeah, go back to, doesn't really matter which one. It's got in. I can go back. No, right. Anyway, well, I'll talk while I can keep going back. Yeah, okay. So even just looking at this, you can see the main thoroughfares of the city and just how wide. Some of them are up to 8 meters across. And the basalt part is 4-5 meters. So I think there's more chance at Ostia than at Pompeii that it was actually perfectly possible for carts to pass in 2 directions. So you don't need a one-way system.
Robert.
Janet, isn't it a bit surprising that there's no evidence, or perhaps there is, for hand carts or sack barrows? I'm thinking of, for example, in modern Istanbul, they carry just about everything down near the hands, near the Golden Horn, on the steep roads, in these huge hand barrows, which they pull, and they're about twice as tall as the actual people pulling them. That's mostly food stuff and textiles. I'm thinking there's lots of ramps, aren't there, in some of the buildings in Ostia and Portus? Would that have been used for hand carts or sack barrows?
So this was a slide I took out because my talk was getting a bit long. There are a few representations in wall paintings from Pompeii of 2 men pulling a small cart, one of which has a modelled ship on it. So it's presumably some kind of religious procession. And in the Casa del Fabbro at Pompeii as well, you know, we have the big cart. We have a big cart at Stabio. We have a big 2-wheeled one at the Casa del Menandro. But in the Casa del Fabbro, we had this dinky little cart, which would be easily pulled by men. It's just was one set of detail too many to include. But yes, I think you're right. That's the other puzzle. What we don't have is wheelbarrows. There's no known Roman wheelbarrow, even though you would think it might be really obvious. I think instead, as in Istanbul, they pulled carts.
Is our interest or obsession with traffic due to the way in which we experience it? So we're annoyed by construction projects because we're driving somewhere. But in ancient Ostia, the vast majority of people are walking. And so it's disruptive to other commercial activity. Perhaps if you've got a big supply of wine coming in and there's a building project going on, it's disrupting the supply of wine. But beyond that, well, you can just get up and walk on the pavement and walk around it. So it only bothers people in litters and other businesses. Is that?
Yes, I would imagine so in cars. But I think building work is disruptive. So, you know, you've got to, particularly for cars, it's really a real, you're right, it's a real vehicle problem. So you know, you've got to get your fuel to the forum baths in order for them to, you know, start stoking up for the next day. And there's a whole heap of pozzolana or something sitting in the street and you can't get your cart past. I mean, that's the sort of problems that building works create. But I mean, we can only create scenarios and think about what might have happened because we'll never know what actually did.
Okay, we have a few more online questions, one from anonymous attendee. Since Ostia was a port, were there not more movements of goods destined for onward destinations, i.e. Rome?
There were, but one of the things I said at the beginning is I'm not really thinking about serving Rome. That's been thought about, and that must have happened only in that narrow stretch along. If you look at the German geophysical survey, there are a lot more warehouses around the river harbour. So what I'm concerned with is not Rome, and which most people are concerned with Rome, but I'm not. I'm concerned with all those people who live in the city. So leaving those out, almost as if they fall into two different segments of the city. The part that's north towards the Tiber, and particularly on the other side of the Tiber, the Ostian Trastevere, where there are even bigger warehouses, and those things that are happening are sort of south of that. So it's a choice of mine. These things certainly existed, but my choice was to look elsewhere.
Tina Obershaw asked, yes, but Ostia survived another 3 centuries on Pompeii. I take it this is in response to your previous answer, but I'm not quite sure.
No,
maybe if they clarify that. And then anonymous attendee, again, a different one or the same one. What about donkey waste? With so many circulating in the street, it must have been enormous. Was it removed or just amassing in the streets?
That's one of the things that the carts leaving the city empty and the Lex Julia Municapalis talk about is removing waste, and that waste would certainly include animal waste as well as some human waste, but because Ostia has a high water table, it doesn't have cesspits like Pompeii, which need emptying. It does have some, I was at a talk a couple of weeks ago, and somebody who's studying the latrines at Ostia, and he says some of them aren't connected to the system. So they must have had like chamber pots underneath which need emptying. So these carts would be taking that waste away. And this waste is extremely valuable for the farmers. So it's their I've got to the point where I lose my words if I get a bit tired. It's their fertilizer. So it's, you know, if you bring the animals in with the carts full of farm produce and you take out a load of human animal waste, then you've got something to gain from it. So there's an incentive to do that as well.
There's no more questions in the room. We just have one more online. David Blackman asked, did the river harbour play a role? Do you think you've touched on already a bit?
Yes, it must have done, because some of the goods that are supplying the city of Ostia must also come from the river, and particularly the grain, the wine and the oil. It's all the rest of it that comes in from the coast or from the territory of Ostia towards Rome.
Okay, if there's no more questions, then I think we should give Janet a break. I'd like to invite everyone upstairs for a glass of Prosecco, but before we do so, can we please thank Janet once again?